Marriage and engagement photographers or videographers of Reddit, have you developed a sixth sense for which marriages will flourish and which will not? What are the green and red flags? Story 1. A friend of mine is a fairly successful engagement and marriage photographer as well as a relationship blogger. She says she can tell how in love a couple is based on whether they pay attention to each other during the photos or to her, the photographer. I guess it's the contrast between sharing an experience together versus fretting over optics. I've never heard her mention specific red flags, but she speaks very highly of couples who are willing to be silly and adventurous in their engagement shoots over those who are just taking the most glamorous or streamlined portraits. She's also a wildlife documentary-style photographer. She doesn't pose people, she follows them around as they hike, rock climb, build campfires, whatever. That's why their attention is significant. It's supposed to be a candid experience and capture their natural dynamic. Story 2. Was a wedding photographer. I think you can kind of tell if they're going to stay together forever based on how they handle all the little and sometimes even big problems a wedding day can bring. There was one couple's story I love to tell. They're not your typical bride and groom. They had their wedding in a forest where you could also go climbing. Sorry, don't know what they're called. With a big wooden house and fireplace in front. All vegan food and a lot of friends with lots of dogs. Everything was perfect, except the special dress the bride had made and painted didn't arrive in time for the ceremony, and she was devastated. She was in her sweatpants and a Mickey Mouse t-shirt at that time, and her soon-to-be husband took off his suit, put on a big white shirt, stood there in his boxer shorts and said, "Well, we have to go," because the ceremony person had to leave an hour later. And she just laughed and went with it. I was in shock, but other than it is strange to have hairy man legs in my wedding photos, taking the pictures was really fun and they were totally relaxed. I'm sure they'll be doing well. Story 3. I gotta tell this one too. I didn't need a sixth sense when I heard that on their honeymoon, the bride cheated on the groom, so the groom's parents didn't want the photos or the video I had shot. Instead, they wanted me to sue her for the remainder of the money they owed me. I told them I was sorry, but they signed the contract, so they had to pay. The bride was a total screw-up to him all day at the wedding. It was no surprise she did this. He was absolutely heartbroken. And yes, they sent me a check for the remainder, and I still have all the photos developed and collecting dust in a pile still in the lab bag I brought them home in. This was in 2003, and I can't bring myself to throw them away. The best part? The groom called me 2 years later to do his wedding photos and video because he was getting married again. I was all set to do it, and then the new fiancé pulled the plug. Turns out she didn't want any memories of the first wedding involved, so I was fired as soon as I was hired. Story 4. I'm a videographer. Most weddings we video are pretty smooth. The couple is happy, family cries tears of joy, lots of laughter, that bit. We did film one wedding that seemed fine right up until the aisle walk. We video the bride and groom prep. They have 2 suites, one for the ladies and one for the gentlemen. My partner and I were having an easy time running back and forth. Everyone is drinking, not light beer either. I meant knocking back shots. Empty bottles everywhere, offering us rounds too as they go by. Everyone is pretty carefree, upbeat, and ready to party. The bride and groom most of all. This is going to be the easiest wedding we film. Or so we thought. Now everyone is seated in the ceremony hall. Groom and all his men are up front with the officiant. Bridesmaids start walking down the aisle, all beautiful. The bride walks in with her father, and at this point I'm filming the groom and his reaction. We get a wide shot because we can always zoom in during post-production. My partner is recording the groom and her father. I see the best man in my viewfinder pull out a flask from his jacket pocket. The rest of the men do the same, except the groom. So this is clearly planned. The best man speaks loud enough over the music so people turn to him away from the bride. He raises his glass high and shouts, "Here's to bride's name. Here's to groom's name. May you never disagree. But if you do," he points at the bride with his flask hand and finishes, "Screw you. Here's to groom's name." They all drink to their frat boy toast, and the best man hands the groom his flask and he drinks it laughing. I've never watched a video more than I have the reaction of the bride and her father. My jaw dropped speechless, and the ceremony went on, and it's not done. The officiant asks the bride, "Do you take groom, yada yada yada," and she surprisingly, yet weakly, says yes. The officiant asks the same of the groom, and instead of just saying yes, he screams, "Hell the freak yeah I do." The bride just face palms herself in embarrassment. The look of disgust on her whole family's faces the entire night after that was priceless and highly awkward to film. I could go on with more stories about this wedding, but this is just about the bride and groom. Needless to say, I think that's a big red flag. Story 5. Wedding videographer here had a couple fly us out to Iceland for their engagement shoot. Now, the first couple of days were fine and everything looked okay, but in Iceland, some lodging options aren't very luxurious. The groom chose to book what was essentially a tiny bunkhouse, the ones meant for those summer camps, and the bride lost it and complained the whole night. The next morning, things are pretty tense and our team continues the shoot as planned, even though it is incredibly awkward. Most of our plans fall through because they just start arguing in front of a beautiful, solitary glacier for 2 hours. Our team can hear them yelling at each other half a mile away because there's literally no one else around for miles. We finished up whatever we could on the last day of the shoot and awkwardly said our goodbyes. Later on, I learned that they broke up a month before the wedding. Story 6. Red flag. The groom winked at both my assistant and me during the ceremony. He was not winking in the sense that he might have been tearing up or had something in his eye, but there was a part in the ceremony where the couple sat down and he would lean his head back in his chair and look past his soon-to-be wife and wink at me or look over his left shoulder and wink at my assistant. It was bizarre. Story 7. Not a wedding photographer, but my parents' wedding video is a tell-all story. At the cake cutting, my mom had specifically asked my dad not to put the cake on her face, which is usually a tradition. Dad did it anyway. Mom smacked him across the face, and Dad said, "Screw this," and stormed out of the reception. They had a 20-year rocky marriage of lies and infidelity and are finally officially divorced. They are much better off now. The cake cutting really seems to be a good rule of thumb for a relationship. Story 8. Photographer here, and to me, the biggest sign is the cake cutting. Some people like to smear cake everywhere as a joke, some people don't. Usually the couple is in sync about this. They know what the other would like and they don't smush cake on the other's face if they wouldn't want that. Sometimes one of them, usually the groom, will force cake all over the other's face and embarrass and upset them. I've seen this happen a handful of times and all of those relationships that I have kept up with have ended in divorce. Story 9. Photographer here, you can tell somewhat based on how the couple treats each other on the wedding day. If they are respectful toward one another and toward me during a day full of stress, then I think that's a good indicator of being able to deal with other problems that may arise during a marriage. Best advice I got about marriage was from my psychology professor. He told us never to marry someone until we've seen how they react when something goes wrong. I think for some couples that may, unfortunately, turn out to be the day of the wedding. Story 10. Ex-wedding photographer. Typically, I saw red flags when the bride or groom is super quiet. I mean silent and just watching. One instance was a groom who barely said 10 words to anyone during the ceremony or reception afterward. The bride and her mother were extremely loud and excited the entire time. The bride needed everything to be quote-unquote perfect. I dropped off the photo bundle with them 2 weeks later and he was still quiet. She, however, complained about all of the pictures because the groom wasn't smiling enough. She wanted a discount because I couldn't make him look happy enough. They got divorced about a year later. I know because I did his engagement photos with his new fiancée about 4 years after his first wedding. His engagement photos showed him much happier. I stopped doing weddings because I do some portraits and most commercial and product work. He called me for a wedding quote, but I had stopped doing them at that point. I do still do portraits, so I offered to do engagement photos for him that he was happy with. Story 11. Wedding videographer here. I try to get to know both people beforehand so I can work on their hobbies and unique traits into my product. A big red flag is when one person is clearly trying to change the other. I had one dude who loved poker, craft beer, cigars, hanging out with his rowdy friends, video games, etc. I planned a cool shoot where I had all his friends in an Old West saloon and he sees his bride-to-be, etc. But she steps in and declares, "Oh, he won't be doing any of those things anymore." Poor bastard just sat there in silence as I awkwardly had to plan their shopping for a Yorkie puppy instead. Halfway through post-production after the wedding, he called and said he was getting an annulment. I wanted to say, "Could have told you so," but I try to stay neutral. Green flags are just the opposite, embracing the other person's habits, hobbies, and interests, basically not being a controlling freak show. Story 12. Wedding videographer here. I don't usually follow the marriage all that close after the video is delivered, but usually you have a feeling as a neutral third party about whether it's going to last or not. While I agree with most of the stuff mentioned here, I've found that the microcosm of how the couple feels about each other usually comes out during the cake cutting. If they're drinking, then they've usually had a few by that point, and it's a moment when everyone is watching you do something potentially awkward with your new significant other. When I see a new bride or groom aggressively smash cake into the other's face, I usually feel that's a strong sign of an unbalanced relationship. Sometimes they're both having fun with it and you can tell it's cool, but most of the time you can tell that the person with cake on their face is either shocked or angry about it. Again, I don't have hard data to track results, but that's a thing that usually informs my opinion about how it's going to work out. Story 13. Cake artist here. I had a couple come in for a tasting. The appointment was for 7 p.m., but he was late. The first half hour was just her. She told me they met at a stable where they both kept their horses. Those horses were going to be featured at the wedding as the bride and groom would ride them to the site, a beautiful farm venue. She described in detail her self-designed medieval gown, flower wreath in her hair, and embroidered shoes like some from a museum. Sounded lovely. She wanted a cake like a castle, which was a specialty of mine. The whole wedding would be over the top, but not in a cringy way. Then he arrives, barely says hi to her, sits down and starts telling me about his wedding. He'll ride in dressed as a riverboat gambler with a frock coat, brocade vest, string tie, big hat, gold pocket watch, and sterling silver spurs. He's fine with a castle cake, but wants to incorporate the watch and a pair of mother-of-pearl handled pistols. I'd already decided that I was not going to work with them. No way could I come up with a cake that would work for them. But they were there, so I brought out the samples. For the next hour, they carried on 2 entirely separate monologues. They didn't address each other or me, and they didn't listen to each other or me. I made no attempt to book them that night, and when they called later in the week, I told them their date had been taken. They were living in 2 incompatible and entirely self-contained fantasies. I doubt they even made it to the wedding day. Story 14. Ex-wedding photographer here. There were only a couple of situations where I had doubts about the couple's future, and one where I was pretty certain. I met the couple in a cafe to discuss their ideas and my services. The girl was very happy, she was very emotional and interested. The guy, however, was rolling his eyes and grunting at everything, and I stopped trying to get him involved in the conversation after he ignored me twice. It made the girl very uncomfortable, and she was apologetic for his behavior. I don't know what happened to them, as they apparently chose to reschedule their wedding and didn't hire me in the end. I also declined to shoot a wedding when the person who was going to hire me was the groom's mom. When I asked her to arrange a meeting with the couple, she said that they didn't want a wedding, meaning they wanted to elope, and it was her initiative to celebrate it. I tried to play the "I want to hear the bride's ideas" card, but she told me the bride has no ideas, she obeys the groom, and the groom obeys mom, so I'll only talk to the mom. And I declined, and I hope the girl is fine. No one deserves a controlling mother-in-law. Finally, I was a guest and a photographer at my friend's wedding. The bridesmaid was wearing a short white dress, and she was chirping about her side hustle modeling for photos and catalogs, how her boyfriend saw her in so many wedding dresses he won't be surprised when she wears one to the wedding, and how she caught 8 bouquets already, this will be her 9th. She talked a lot about wedding planning and stuff, but apparently there hadn't even been a formal proposal, and her boyfriend, who was also a guest, looked very annoyed and clearly wished he were somewhere else. Anyway, the bridesmaid started bugging me for photos of her and her boyfriend a week after the wedding. I told her several times that when I start editing the photos, I will do hers first, and by the time I did send her the photos, they were already broken up. She started dating someone else a month later and got married the next year. Story 15. I used to work in a day of wedding coordination. I remember 2 couples that I couldn't wait to hear about the divorce. When you pay a wedding coordinator, you only pay for the things the coordinator orders or plans, like flowers and catering and DJ, plus coordinator fees. Anything else couples buy, like dresses, gifts, and suits, etc., is added. We estimated this to be a $500,000 wedding easy, and Dad paid for all of it. The bride was a total sweetheart when I met her. The groom seemed quiet but was also very easygoing. Always nice to have a sober groom, and he didn't drink a drop during the day. Then the photographer and videographer left to take some venue shots. The bride began berating everyone, myself included, on how her perfect day had to be capped out because no one wanted to give her more. My clothes were trashy, the DJ's computer was a PC, the bar staff was wearing red vests, and she hates vests. The photographer came back and she was an angel again. The second was a wedding of a general and pediatric surgeon in the local hospital. Paid for their own beautiful and in their means wedding. The bride was seriously amazing, but there was a mix-up on the day of the wedding. The 200 chairs that were supposed to be moved to the third story of the historic building weren't taken upstairs. So my boss, the other assistant, and the 8-month pregnant venue coordinator started carrying chairs upstairs. 3 flights. It wasn't great. After the wedding, we had to do it again, but down. The father of the groom started helping us. We begged him to enjoy his son's day, but he responded that if it were his daughter doing this, he'd be furious. The groom comes by and tells his dad to stop helping the pregnant woman stack chairs. He looks at the monster that is his son and asks how he'd feel if it was his wife or sister who had to do this. Groom told his dad that maybe if we had applied ourselves a little more, we wouldn't have been taking out the trash at a successful couple's wedding. Clearly, he didn't know how much his wife was paying us. Story 16. Wedding planner here. Red flags? When their nerves are normal, but when one of the pair starts doubting whether they should go through with it way before the day, you know something isn't quite right. Green flags? They make decisions together and have each other's backs, especially when the family can be pressuring. Side note, we had a stressful, let's put it that way, wedding due to my parents and sister. The biggest thing I took away from that was feeling like it was me and my husband and a secret team managing all the outrageous family and manipulative crap around us. I felt like we were partners in a spy novel or something. He was the only person I could fully rely on, and we'd sneak off to the pub to decompress and plan our strategies almost every afternoon. It only strengthened my desire to marry him. I felt like we were 100% secret-only, sane people here, Team Us. Story 17. The best wedding I ever saw, the groom really liked donuts, so the reception had a giant donut wall and it was so cool. The bride and groom just seemed to exude happiness. You could see genuine love, respect, and joy in their eyes. I knew they were going to make it. The weirdest one I saw wasn't anything major, but the bride just didn't seem to care. Maybe she was simply a really laid-back person, but my job was to follow her for the day, and she was doing so much of nothing that I texted my boss and took an early lunch, returned for the ceremony. I can usually also tell by the friend group how happy the couple is going to be when I see them together. The ones whose friends are so happy to be there with them on that day, they're the ones with big smiles the whole time. And it's said a lot, but it's true. The more expensive weddings are usually less fun and a lot more stressful. Story 18. The biggest red flag I ever saw, I was the assistant photographer at a wedding that took place in a 20-ish story hotel. I took the groom downstairs to meet his groomsmen for photos on the street, riding alone with him on the elevator. He'd had a couple of beers with his groomsmen but was far from drunk. On the elevator ride, he looked at himself in the reflective metal doors of the elevator and said, loud enough for me to hear, "What the hell are you doing?" I stayed completely silent and didn't say a word. We get off the elevator and neither of us mentions it. I have no idea if they're still married. The wedding happened at least 8 years ago, and I don't remember their names. I was just an assistant after all, so I wasn't responsible for client intake or anything like that. Story 19. Video editor here. I've had my fair share of wedding videos back then. Red flags? One partner is having a lot of fun, dancing and mingling, while the other is mostly sitting down. They aren't smiling except when taking photos. The vows are very fluffy or almost selfish, like how you'd imagine an 11-year-old talking about their Prince Charming. Bonus if the counterpart has something very short and not as emotional. Green flags. They can't keep away from each other, laughing during the first dance, at the aisle, cake, speeches, etc. I know it can be cheesy for some, but themed weddings, people that can dork out together, stay together. Story 20. Photographer here. I've done a few engagement photos and weddings. Red flags? When one person is critical of the other during the shoot but then posts the photos with the caption, "About to marry my best friend and my soulmate." Also, when they badly Photoshop themselves and their partners to appear better looking than they actually are. Green flags. A couple who can laugh together when doing awkward poses, when they're wiping sweat from their foreheads, and when something goes wrong in general. I only edit the lighting and background of photos. I have never and will never edit someone's body. Once I have been paid for my edited photos, I do believe the photos belong to the couple and they're free to tweak them any way they like. Although I do think there is no need to edit your face or your body. People who are truly happy for you don't care how perfect you look in your photos. Besides, I think that genuine love and happiness make the most beautiful photos, not a slim waist and perfect skin. I did a photo shoot for a couple in the middle of an intense Texas summer. It was incredibly hot and humid that day and the man was sweating rivers. He and his fiancée were such good sports about it though. I've done photo shoots for brides-to-be who get extremely offended and angry when their partner doesn't look perfect. I was very happy that this particular bride-to-be just had a good time taking silly photos with her fiancé. Honestly, their photos turned out great. Story 21. Used to be a wedding planner. Red flags: constant apologizing for their other halves' behavior or attitude, lack of input from one of them, too much input from a family member or family members. Anger is the inability to make a decision and stick with it, overriding a once joint agreement of something. At one wedding, I didn't actually meet the groom till the day of. I just knew his name, Joseph. Green flags: when a couple mutually respects the other's wishes and compromises, both are present at every meeting, supportive and patient, friendly and respectful of staff. When you can tell they are both relieved to see one another again and it's like no one else is there. It's like an unspoken conversation with each other and it makes me smile. Story 22. Not a photographer, but I have been a wedding makeup artist for a decade. Now me, I don't often meet the husband, so this is more my observation of the bride. I have a feeling my face looks like I'm trying to smile during a diarrhea attack while I'm thinking, you poor thing, about the hubby. Red flags: the bride already trashed on mimosas at noon. The bride ordered everyone around. The bride having a meltdown about stupid stuff like seating arrangements. Mother-in-laws that refuse to even sit next to each other to get makeup done. Bride talking smack about hubs' family. Bridal party fighting with each other. Caring more about spending a ton of money and being fancy-pantsy than being kind to your loved ones. Green flags: they had Dick's Burgers and a keg for the food or drink. Super laid-back people. When literally everything was going wrong, the bride and family were laughing and hugging and sorting it out. Like the caterer didn't bring enough food, they ordered pizza. DJ didn't show, so bride made a playlist on her phone of her hubs' favorite music. And then my fave: they were both Harry Potter fans. The pre-ceremony gift and card, they gave each other the same exact gift and card. It was sweet as hell.